Hello and welcome to The Pitch, brought to you by Livewire Markets. My name's Eddie Orchard, and today we're sitting down with David Wimborne from Impacts Asset Management to discuss some of the opportunities he's seeing in a transition to a more sustainable economy. David, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
The sustainability transition is a pretty passionate topic amongst investors. Why, in your view, is the thematic worth backing?
Yeah, I think it's a very, very powerful trend over time. I think that's how I would summarize it. As you may know, Impacts has only focused on this sustainable transition over this time. And the way that we've always framed this opportunity is the reason why we do what we do is to generate better financial returns. It's not responsible investment, it's not ethical investment. And we think kind of that pure focus on generating those better returns that was really sort of resonated with investors over time. Now, why is it an attractive opportunity? The reason why is because essentially we think there are four drivers driving us towards a more sustainable global economy. The first is technological improvement. In other words, technology is improving and it's enabling the adoption of more sustainable technologies across all sorts of different sectors. You see that with the rise of electric cars as one example. Consumer preference is another one, where consumers are much more aware of the impact of their purchase decision. People might consider buying an electric car now, or even in the food industry. You see concern about the rise of ultra-processed food. What does that mean? Consumers might, want to consume sort of healthier, less processed food. The third driver is the fact that companies are changing their behaviours in response to consumers wanting different things. You see in that food industry, the fact that large food producers now producing more natural food products is one example. And the final driver is policy and regulation. And generally, even though obviously we've got a bit of uncertainty in the US at the moment, absolutely the trajectory of policy and regulation globally is more support behind lots of these markets. And so we think taken together, those four drivers really sort of push the global economy towards a more sustainable footing and actually provide some really attractive investment opportunities.
I noticed in the portfolio as well that I think when most people look at this idea of sustainability, the first thing they think about is energy.
Yep.
You have a zero weight to the energy sector.
Yep.
So how and what sectors are you looking at to get that exposure to that sustainability theme?
Yeah, so if I was to summarize how we try to capture, lots of these elements of kind of moving to a lower carbon economy, it's really through kind of those companies that basically enable greater energy efficiency in existing processes. So we have lots of companies in the industrial and IT sector which really sort of focus on those areas. So, just thinking of a couple of companies we have in the portfolio, one is a company called Schneider Electric. Schneider Electric is a French company. It provides primarily medium and low voltage equipment, which does a couple of really interesting things. Firstly, it is some of the building blocks behind buildings' energy efficiency. Buildings are huge emitters of carbon, and if we can find ways to reduce those carbon profiles, that's great. And as well as reducing the cost of those companies, which is a fantastic thing. And then the second would be looking at companies that renew a very aging electrical grid infrastructure. If we look at, say, the US, for example, the most amazing thing is that the transmission and distribution cabling in the US, the typical age of those cables is 25 years. Now, if you think of that in the context of a GDP which has probably doubled over that time and population which has probably doubled, obviously, we need a huge amount of investment to that. And that's not even getting on to the huge amount of extra transmission and distribution cabling you'll need with the data center boom we're seeing at the moment. So areas like that we think kind of, will play a greater role in the whole sort of, I guess, getting more from less trend. So often industrial companies will help us. And then maybe just looking at IT as well, we've got exposure to a number of companies in the portfolio that make the factory environment more energy efficient. And this is essentially through automation. So for example, in the portfolio, we have a company called Keyence, which is a Japanese company that makes optical sensors for production lines. And why that has a big energy efficiency saving is the fundamental reason why you automate a factory is not necessarily to save costs, it's actually for product standardization. And when you standardize products, then you basically have less waste as a result of that. So those kind of companies making the factory more efficient, buildings more efficient, grid more efficient, all play a really, really important role. And that's where we try to, focus our investment energies.
And with any transition, you're going to get a few winners and plenty of losers. How do you go about identifying who's going to be the winners and the losers out of this trade?
Well, that's a really interesting point. So I think picking the winners and losers is really hard, actually. I think one way that we typically try and approach it is we try to invest in the enablers of a transition. So let's take the transition that we're very aware of at the moment, the transition towards electric cars. Now, I don't really have any idea whether Tesla or BYD or resurgent Volkswagen is going to dominate the electric vehicle paradigm, But what we do know is that demand for things like electric vehicle architecture, autonomous driving solutions will increase, almost regardless of which car company dominates that paradigm. So what we're trying to do is essentially invest in some of the enablers of that change without betting on one company dominating a particular area. And that's a very, very common pattern across our end markets. And one other maybe interesting example, I touched on the transition towards more healthy natural food. We wouldn't be so interested in like a big food producer like a Nestle or Unilever and Danone. Instead, we're interested in the food ingredient companies that basically provide the reformulation solutions to those large food groups so they can make their products less heavy in salt and sugar and artificial flavors. So it's really kind of the enablers of change rather than trying to pick the winners or the losers.
And on those enablers, could you maybe take us through one or two companies within the portfolio that kind of illustrate that view?
Yeah, absolutely. So a very big holding within the portfolio is an industrial gas company called Linde. And for those that are not so familiar with industrial gas companies, essentially what these companies do is they separate atmospheric gas. So it's called a process of fractionation, and they separate into its constituent parts, so carbon dioxide, oxygen, trace elements. Now, these gases are used really as a building blocks of efficiency across so many different industries. So, in the production of diesel, they use the desulfurized diesel fuel to make it less environmentally harmful. It's used to purify water, so it's used by water utility companies. It's used by the food industry. So when you buy your packaged food product and you see kind of the transparent layer, you'll see some gas in there. That's an inert gas provided by one of the industrial gas companies. So really, they have a very, very almost systemically important role to play. But what I think is really interesting is if you think about this transition to a lower carbon world, one of the big bottlenecks there will be decarbonising very difficult to decarbonise industries, things like cement production, steel production, and things like that. Linde and a handful of other industrial gas companies have the technology called carbon capture and storage technology, and essentially that will capture some of the emissions from those industries and help them get to a lower carbon profile. So when I look around and I think about the companies that really will play a crucial role in this transition, Linde is right up there as being incredibly important to moving to a lower carbon economy.
Amazing. Thank you very much for your time today, David. That was really interesting.
Thank you for your time. Thank you.
And I hope you enjoyed that too. If you do, feel free to give it a like and head to our YouTube channel where we're adding fresh content every week.